2NURFM 103.7. It is time to have a look at politics, and indeed our final look at things happening in the political sphere for 2020 with Dr. Jim Joes from the University of Newcastle, our Professor of Politics. Jim, what a year it has been in politics. It is every year, but this year it certainly threw a few things at us.
Yes, good morning, Mark. It's been a remarkable year for twists and turns, and a terrible year for governments generally, but particularly in Australia with the federal government and the state governments. But for the Morrison government, it started badly because of the bushfires and everything, and the fact that the Prime Minister was away on holidays at a time when many people were not happy that he was out of the country at a time of what appeared to be a national disaster. That was compounded by a continual refusal by various spokespeople with the government to acknowledge that there's probably a connection here between the severity and intensity of the bushfires and the dynamics of climate change. However, things sort of look better for the Prime Minister. I'm not sure if we can say they look better in the sense that, you know, we have a pandemic disaster, but out of that, the Prime Minister and the Morrison government seem to find a little bit more focus and find their straps. Innovative in terms of creating a national cabinet to handle and coordinate the sort of nationwide dealings with the pandemic. The negative side of that was that they made it a subcommittee of the formal cabinet of government, which meant that the deliberations and any documentation wasn't accessible and publicly available. Nonetheless, you would have thought that the Prime Minister would be able to take some solace in the fact that he turned around a negative situation in terms of his leadership and the government standing, and basically steered Australia largely through the pandemic. There are various ups and downs in that, of course, but overall one would think he should be able to say he's able to end the year on a high note, having guided us through that.
Look, particularly, Jim, if you look to other nations around the world that certainly have had a worse run this year than Australia has. I mean, we had, compared to the rest of the world, we've had kind of everything going away a little bit. And also most of the state governments and the federal governments too. I mean, you never let a good disaster go to waste. And a lot of them, regardless of what we've thought of some of their dealings, how they've handled with certain aspects of, in terms of voter popularity, have come out okay.
In the main, Mark, I think that's a fair comment. The expression "not to let a good crisis go to waste" has certainly not been lost on various governments, but in particular the Morrison government. They've begun now using COVID as their trigger and rationale for a whole range of policy development, shall we say here. It's not so much a policy shift, it's more a case of being able to implement the sorts of policies that they may not have been able to put into place or get away with had there not been the COVID pandemic. For example, the current discussion that's going on in the Parliament around the new industrial relations reforms. Most of those reforms are marginal at best. They're more about implementing the coalition's agenda around a very narrow range of interests. The COVID pandemic gives them a point of leverage that most people in the general voter public will say, okay, well, it's had this impact on the economy, and yes, there's probably good rationale here. But when you peel that back, there's actually very little evidence to support what the government's doing. And there are a number of areas in which the government has been moving, which have used the COVID pandemic as a means of making them more palatable. The other side of the coin, though, for the government, I think here, not so much about the COVID pandemic in itself, but about our relationships with the US government and its response to the COVID pandemic, and the outgoing President Donald Trump. And Australia, to some extent, or the Morrison government to some extent, tied itself too closely to Trump announcements rather than a more sober reflection on a sort of incremental approach to make sure that they didn't push themselves into spaces that they were going to find it hard to manoeuvre. And unfortunately, we're now in that situation with the Trump administration on its way out and its very rampant hostility to the Chinese government. And there are good reasons for some degree of dissonance, shall we say. But the Morrison government came out with all guns blazing, in effect, going gung-ho in favour of Donald Trump's approach rather than saying what's the best approach for Australia to take. And now, of course, with Joe Biden about to step into the president's shoes with a reset of the US relations between China as one of his major areas, then the Australian government's got to now reset, but it's also finding itself, sort of, shall we say, sinking deeper into the quicksand of its own creation.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see what happens with the whole China thing for 2021. Now, of course, Christmas is here, Jim, and most of the pollies, unless there is a crisis that pops up, they're all sort of out of our hair for a little while. Where do you see the two majors heading for 2021, mate? Will we see an early election late next year? How do you think the PM will go? And, of course, on the other side of things, Labor, a few rumblings that, Albanese could probably not even hang on.
Well, there are a number of sort of stories circulating at the moment, and I think part of that's media-driven, particularly driven through the Murdoch press with, generating news stories on the one hand, but also attempting to manipulate on the other, which they've become far more engaged in trying to influence political outcomes than has been evident in the past. The Labor Party under Albanese has done medium well, if you like, in the sense that Mr. Albanese has tried to play a constructive role in a very difficult situation with the pandemic, so not being anti-government, hostile to government, but trying to work constructively. However, having said that, there have been a number of opportunities for an opposition to score some very serious political points and to hold the government to much stronger account. And at the moment, it appears as if they are missing those opportunities. So come next year, there will probably be some ructions within the Labor Party, and whether Mr. Albanese is able to hold on and recalibrate what the party's going to be doing vis-a-vis the voters, or whether they will show him the door is another matter. But as for both parties, I don't think an early election is on the cards. Perhaps at least certainly not in the first 6 months of 2021, although the government only has a one-seat majority. And it may, given the climate change issue and Australia's almost pariah status, no, let me repeat that, rephrase that, Mark, pariah status on the world stage in relation to climate change and what we claim we do and what we should be doing, that might precipitate a political crisis for the government that they may not be able to recover from and may be forced into an early election around that issue. That also depends on the Labor Party being able to focus its own political attention around this in a way that holds the government to account and pushes them into that tipping point where they are forced into an election.
All right, well, that's all for 2021. I reckon if they're going to do it, it'll be late next year, but I don't think Albo will be there. He'll be gone.
Well, we'll have to wait and see. But certainly, I agree with you. It won't be until the latter half of 2021 because we'll be 2 years plus into the 3-year cycle. Whether Albanese can hold on is another matter. But, some of the rumblings we've been hearing are they're still talking yesterday's politics and we're in the 21st century and the Labor Party has yet to refigure how it can operate in the 21st century and who its actual voter base is really going to be.
That's something for them to figure out. They may have those discussions, I'm sure, over Christmas. Jim, we'll put a pause on it right there. And thanks for your input through 2020. We will catch you for another look at politics early February next year.
My pleasure, Mark, and have a Merry Christmas and all the listeners a safe and happy Christmas and New Year.
Same here, Jim. 2NURFM 103.7.
2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.